Okay, so we're going to be looking at uh, a concept that's covered in the activity on Desmos, but I want to go into it a little bit deeper because it's going to be really important not only for this year, but like thinking about how do we characterize patterns that we see between variables, right? And so we're going to talk about two terms that we can use to characterize patterns, which are increasing and decreasing patterns. So I titled my page and I put my name on the top right, so you should do that as well. And then I'm going to start just by putting those two terms on my notes. An increasing pattern, so a pattern that's increasing, and then a decreasing pattern. Okay, so put those two terms in our notes. So on Desmos, we have a slide that tells us a little bit more about what these terms mean. So it says, we saw an example of a new kind of pattern of change, a decreasing relationship, right? So decreasing relationship. Patterns of change can be increasing or decreasing. And it gives us an example. It says, when one pattern increasing makes the other variable increase, we call that pattern of change increasing. So what we mean is, so let's write that definition over here. So increasing pattern is when an increase in one variable makes the other variable increase. So that means if I increase one variable, I increase the other. So for example, and there's a few examples in your CMP book that we've done already, but I'll give you a quick example here. So let's say we have two variables, which is how many miles you drive and how much gas you use, right? So this is an increasing pattern because when you drive more miles, when you increase this variable, right, you increase the other. So when I increase the number of miles I drive, I increase how much gas I use, right? So that's an increasing pattern when they both increase. When an increase in one variable makes the other variable increase. On the graph here, it tells us that this red line here shows an increasing pattern, and we can see that when we increase on the x-axis, right, we also increase on the y, right? So over here, the y is right here at 1. But if I increase on the x-axis to maybe, let's say, 8, we're much further up on the y-axis, right? So when I increase x, y increases as well, which means it's an increasing relationship. So an increased relationship on a graph is often going to look like this, right? So I might just include that on my notes as like a visual definition, right? So like in science, when we did our visual definitions for some vocab words, my visual definition for increasing pattern might be, you know, we have a graph of two variables, and when I increase one, I increase the other, right? So you'll often see these double up arrows like here too, because they both increase. So an increasing pattern is when we increase one variable and it makes the other variable increase. And there's an example that's given here. So it says this graph shows an example of an increasing relationship. This is a graph that shows the cost for renting different amounts of bikes. Below, you can change N, which is the amount of bikes that you rent, right here. And you can see that the cost goes up when the number of bikes goes up or increases. So you can play around with this on the Desmos activity too, right? You can take your finger and you can drag, or your clicker, whatever, and you can drag this point to see, okay, if I have 10 bikes, it costs $150 right down here, 10 bikes. And if I increase the number of bikes to, let's say, 30 bikes, I pay $450, right? So what that tells us is when I look at this graph, I can say that when the number of bikes goes up, that means that the cost goes up. So number of bikes goes up and cost goes up. So when I increase the number of bikes, I also increase the cost. That tells me that this is an increasing relationship. Cool. An increasing relationship. All right. And then we have another kind of relationship is the opposite, right? So if an increasing pattern means an increase in one variable makes the other variable increase, a decreasing pattern is, make my pen a little bit thicker here, when an increase in one variable makes the other variable decrease. So I'll say more about what I mean in a second. So decreasing pattern is when an increase in one variable makes the other variable decrease. So up here when we said increasing, we saw that when we increase one, we increase the other. That's an increasing pattern. In a decreasing pattern, we have something that increases and it makes the other variable decrease. So a really simple example is, let's say you want to see, you're looking at two variables, right? You're looking at, let's say you get $20 to go to the movies. So let's say you have snacks you buy. So that's one variable, is how many snacks you buy. And the other variable you have is how much money you have left. Right? So I have snacks that I buy and I have how much money that I have left. Those are my two variables. So if I buy snacks, right? Let's say that I buy more snacks. Let's say that I increase the number of snacks that I buy. The amount of money that I have left isn't going to increase, it's going to decrease, right? So when snacks that I buy goes up, when I increase the number of snacks that I buy, I decrease how much money I have left. So a decreasing pattern is when an increase in one variable makes the other variable decrease. So there's an example of this in your CMP activity for today, right? That's kind of why we're talking about it. So, and it's shown on this slide here. It says this graph shows an example of a decreasing relationship. This is a graph that shows the number of customers that would pay different tour prices to go on a bike tour. So you can change the tour price and you can see what happens when we change the tour price to the number of customers that would pay. And we see that the number of customers decreases. So I'll show you an example. So right here we have a graph of two variables, right? And we can look at the axes to see the two variables. We have number of customers on the y-axis and we have tour price on the x-axis. And we can see that when we drag our point, let's say I want to increase how much the tour is going to cost, I see that the number of customers decreases, right? Because fewer people are going to pay. So if the tour costs 50 bucks, 45 people will pay that price to go on the tour. But if I increase the price to $300, only 20 people will pay, right? So what we see when we play around with that graph is that we have two variables. We have number of, whoops, that's a really big pen. We have number of customers. And we have the tour price. So if I increase the tour price, let's say instead of $200, I say I want to go to $350. What I see is that the number of customers goes from 30 to 15, right? So the number of customers decreases. So that tells me if the tour price going up makes the number of customers go down, that tells me that this is a decreasing relationship or a decreasing pattern. You might also notice, and I saw some people who had got to the activity early who were noticing on both this example up here and the one on the bottom that graphs for decreasing patterns look different than graphs for increasing patterns in the sense that instead of, we said an increasing pattern makes this shape here where it's going up and to the right, a decreasing pattern goes down and to the right, right? Because as you get further along the x-axis, your y-axis decreases, right? Because when one increases, the other decreases for a decreasing pattern. We'll also talk about that more later because we have a name for that. We call it negative slope and positive slope for increasing pattern. We'll get there. Okay, so we got some simple notes about what increasing and decreasing patterns are and some things that we might keep in mind, right? So like we're looking for what happens when we increase one variable, does the other variable increase for an increasing pattern or decrease for a decreasing pattern? And we're going to look at shapes that we see in graphs, right? But also patterns we can see in tables that tell us whether something is increasing or decreasing, right? So keep an eye out for some more questions and stories and thoughts in the next few days or so, kind of asking you to think more about like what are examples of increasing and decreasing relationships? What do they look like in real life? What do they look like on graphs? What do they look like in stories or in tables? So I hope this helped.